In the spring of 1515, as the tulips bloomed across the Bosphorus and the domes of Istanbul glittered under the imperial sun, a child was born who would one day shake the very foundations of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Mustafa, the son of the future Sultan, Suleiman, and the concubine Mahidevran Hatun. From his earliest days, destiny seemed to sing in his blood. Born into the house of Osman, a dynasty that had conquered half the known world, Mustafa was not just a prince. He was an heir, and not just any heir, but the son of the man who would become Kanuni, Sultan Suleiman, the lawgiver, the Magnificent. The court astrologers read in his stars a life of greatness, and for a time, their predictions seemed true. He was clever, handsome, bold, a born commander and a favorite of the Janissaries, who whispered that he was a sultan in waiting. Yet the Ottoman court was not a place for innocence. Behind the latticed windows of the harem, ambition sharpened like a blade. Every smile hid a scheme, every lullaby a warning. And from the very moment Mustafa was cradled in silk, forces were already shifting against him. Mustafa was raised in the traditional Ottoman manner. At a young age, he was sent to the provinces, first to Manisa, the classical training ground for heirs to the throne. There, he learned to govern, to command, to survive. His court in Manisa became a center of brilliance. Poets, scholars, generals, all gathered around the rising star of the dynasty. The people loved him. The soldiers adored him. His name was sung in markets and whispered with hope across the empire. For he was not only Suleiman's eldest son, he was the one who most resembled the Sultan in strength, in stature, in vision. And yet, the seeds of tragedy were already taking root. For in the shadows of the Topkapi palace, another force was rising. Hürrem Sultan, Suleiman's favorite consort, a woman of cunning intelligence and relentless ambition. A former slave from Ruthenia, she had captivated the Sultan's heart and changed the very order of the court. She bore Suleiman sons of her own, princes who, by the laws of seniority, stood behind Mustafa. But Hürrem was not content with second place. She would not allow her children to live in the shadow of Mahidevran's son. And so, the court divided. On one side stood Mustafa, the warrior prince, loved by the people, praised by poets, trusted by the army. On the other, Hürrem, veiled in silk, cloaked in secrecy, holding the heart of the empire in her jeweled hands. Between them stood Suleiman, a father, a ruler, a man torn between love and legacy. To fulfill her ambitions, Hürrem needed an ally within the machinery of power. She found him in Rustam Pasha, a brilliant administrator who married her daughter Mihrimah and rose swiftly through the ranks to become Grand Vizier. Where Mustafa had the hearts of men, Rustam had the machinery of the state. Together, he and Hürrem worked in whispers, forging alliances, planting doubts, poisoning loyalties. Reports began to circulate, quietly at first, then louder. Mustafa was ambitious, yes, but was he loyal? Did he plot behind his father's back? Did he speak of seizing the throne before Suleiman's death? Letters were forged, witnesses were bribed, and the image of the noble prince began to darken in Suleiman's mind. And yet, even then, Mustafa stood tall. He led campaigns, crushed rebellions, and returned victorious. In Persia, he won glory for the empire. In Anatolia, he maintained order. His men would die for him. The Janissaries chanted his name, but none of it mattered if his father doubted him. And the Sultan's doubt, once kindled, grew like wildfire. In the Ottoman world, there was no greater sin than rebellion, no punishment more final than the bowstring. Princes who threatened the throne did not live to tell their side of the story. And the moment Suleiman began to question Mustafa's loyalty, the end had already begun. It was subtle at first, orders delayed, messages unanswered, a growing coldness in the letters from the capital. Mustafa, always the proud son, tried to reach his father, to reassure him, to remind him of his loyalty. But his enemies had done their work well. When Suleiman left for his Persian campaign in 1553, he summoned his son to meet him at the camp in Konya. For Mustafa, it was a summons from his father, perhaps a reconciliation. But for others, it was a trap. Rustam Pasha, ever the architect of intrigue, arranged everything. He filled the camp with whispers of rebellion. He warned Suleiman that Mustafa might arrive with an army at his back. Mustafa, unaware of the plot against him, travelled light. He wore no armour. He brought no soldiers. He entered his father's tent with humility and never walked out again. The scene inside the imperial tent was one of both ceremony and slaughter. Mustafa bowed before his father, perhaps sensing something was wrong, perhaps still hoping for forgiveness. But Suleiman sat silent, his face unreadable. The guards stepped forward. Mustafa resisted. He struggled. He fought like a lion. His cries rang across the camp. Cries of betrayal, of disbelief, of fury. But the guards were strong. The bowstring was pulled. And the brightest star of the Ottoman dynasty was extinguished. His body was carried from the tent. The Janissaries wept. His soldiers tore their garments. In the towns and cities of the empire, people whispered of injustice, of a father turned executioner, of a prince whose only crime was being too beloved. Suleiman had preserved his throne, but at what cost? The death of Şehzade Mustafa sent shockwaves across the empire. The people mourned. The Janissaries grew restless. Even among the Sultan's loyalists, there were whispers that a great mistake had been made. Mahidevran, Mustafa's mother, was shattered. She withdrew from court, a grieving lioness, left to mourn her only son. Hürrem's sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, now stood in line for the throne, but none had Mustafa's strength, his charisma, his command. Cihangir, who adored his older brother, died shortly after Mustafa's execution, some said from sorrow. Bayezid rebelled years later and was executed. Only Selim remained, a man known more for drink than for discipline. He would become Selim II, Selim the Sot, and under his reign, the long Ottoman decline would begin. The age of Suleiman ended not with his death, but with the murder of his heir. History is full of what-ifs, and none looms larger in the Ottoman tale than the question of Mustafa. What if he had lived? What if he had ruled? Would the empire have endured longer, stronger, more just? Would its conquests have continued? Would the corruption and weakness that followed have been held at bay? We will never know. But one thing is certain. In the eyes of his soldiers, his poets, and even many of his enemies, Şehzade Mustafa was the last great hope of the House of Osman. He died not as a rebel, not as a traitor, but as a son, a brother, a prince, betrayed by the very throne he would have served. And in the dusty corners of the imperial palace, some say his name still echoes, a name that once promised greatness and met only sorrow.